Before we begin tonight's journey into forgotten history, if you enjoy these calm, immersive stories of the past, I invite you to subscribe to our channel. It only takes a moment, but it means everything to us. Your support helps us keep uncovering history's most hidden chapters and bringing them to life in these long bedtime narratives. And if you're here listening right now, I'd love to know, what time is it where you are, and where in the world are you watching from? Drop your answer in the comments below. I always enjoy seeing how people across the globe share this same moment of quiet reflection together. Now, let us begin. Asterisk, when you think of the Bronze Age, you might imagine gleaming weapons, shining helmets, or ancient palaces. To understand it fully, you have to start where it all began, with rivers. In Mesopotamia, often called the land between the rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates carried not only water, but the foundations of civilization itself. Imagine the slow, steady rhythm of life along those floodplains. The rivers rose and fell, sometimes bringing fertile soil, sometimes destruction. Farmers learned to dig canals, to manage water with ditches and embankments. This wasn't glamorous work, it was endless labor, shifting earth under a hot sun, repairing levees after floods, and maintaining the channels that allowed barley to grow where desert should have been. It was here, around 3500 BCE, that the world's first true cities emerged. Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Rito. These weren't cities in the modern sense, but dense collections of mud brick houses clustered near temples and granaries. At their heart stood ziggurat-stepped temple platforms that dominated the skyline. Workers hauled clay bricks, thousands upon thousands of them, each dried in the sun. They built not for beauty, but for durability. Inside these early cities, life was crowded. Narrow lanes wound between walls, with animals often living in the same courtyards as people. The smell of clay ovens mixed with that of manure. Families slept on reed mats, cooked with clay pots, and stored food in great jars sealed with clay stoppers. The invention of writing cuneiform was not born from poetry or literature, but from the dull needs of administration. Grain rations, livestock counts, trade receipts. The first scribes pressed reeds into wet clay tablets, recording debts and deliveries. You could almost picture the scribes at work, sitting cross-legged on the floor, clay tablets stacked nearby, their styluses leaving wedges and lines that turned spoken words into permanent marks. First, these were picture-screwed symbols, but soon they became abstract, standardized, a system that could track everything from temple donations to land disputes. Writing was not about creativity, it was about control. As populations grew, so too did hierarchy. At the top, priests and kings claimed authority, often tied directly to the gods. Below them, administrators and scribes. Meet those, craftsmen, farmers, laborers, and slaves. Mesopotamia's cities ran on grain, and grain required workers. Men, women, and children labored in fields outside the walls, planting, weeding, harvesting, threshing. They brought their harvests to the city storehouses, where officials measured and rationed. In return, they received food, protection, and the right to live under the shadow of the temple. Bronze itself was not native to Mesopotamia. Copper came from Oman, tin from distant lands, as far as Anatolia or Central Asia. Traders traveled long distances, carrying goods by boat along rivers, or across deserts with donkeys. The wealth of Mesopotamian cities depended not only on farming, but on these trade networks. Without imported tin, there would be no bronze. Without bronze, no tools, no weapons, no symbols of power for kings to display. But daily life was not about kings or trade caravans. It was about survival. The average Mesopotamian ate a diet of barley bread, onions, dates, and sometimes beer fermented. Thick, almost like porridge. Beer was safer to drink than river water, which could be polluted by waste. It was not a luxury, It was a staple. Children grew up drinking it. Workers were often paid in beer rations. Homes were simple, 1 or 2 rooms, built of mud brick, often with a rooftop where people could sleep on hot nights. Its furniture was basic low stools, reed baskets, wooden chests. Life was fragile. Disease was common, and infant mortality was high. To cope, families often had many children, knowing some would not survive. Religion was everywhere. People believed that gods controlled the floods, the harvests, and the outcome of wars. Temples were not just places of worship, but economic centers, storing grain, owning land, employing workers. Offerings were made daily: food, beer, incense, small clay figurines. Rituals were performed to keep the gods appeased, because an angry god meant famine or disaster. One of the most important gods was Inanna, later known as Ishtar. She was goddess of love and war, a reflection of life's contradictions. In her temples, priestesses conducted rituals that outsiders often misunderstood. The myths told of her descent into the underworld, her conflicts with other gods, her shifting powers. These myths shaped the way people saw their world: unpredictable, fragile, full of dangers and opportunities. The city of Uruk, in particular, grew to perhaps 50,000 people, an enormous population for its time. It was here that Gilgamesh, the semi-legendary king, ruled. His story, preserved on clay tablets, became the world's first great epic. Yet, even this story is full of mundane details: journeys, fears, arguments, the inevitability of death. The Epic of Gilgamesh is not only about gods and monsters, but about human struggle, loss, and the longing for permanence. Archaeology reveals the remains of these cities: broken pottery, clay tablets, foundations of mud brick walls. These fragments tell us about daily routines more than grand battles. We know how many sheep were sacrificed at a temple on a given day, how much grain was stored, which families owed taxes. It is the boring records, not the grand myths, that show us the real Mesopotamia. Yet, beneath this order always lay risk. Floods could wash away fields. Drought could bring famine. Invaders could plunder cities. The fragility of life was constant, and people coped by building systems, religious, political, economic, that gave some sense of security. The birth of cities was not just progress, but necessity. To survive in such an environment, people had to live together, share resources, and create institutions larger than any one family. Still, questions remain. Why here, in Mesopotamia, and not elsewhere, did the first great cities rise? Was it simply the rivers, Tate, or something in the culture, the people, the accidents of trade and geography? And perhaps more curiously, what was it like for the ordinary farmer, the anonymous worker, whose name was never pressed into clay, but whose labor sustained it all? Asterisk. If Section 1 showed us how rivers and farming laid the foundations of the first Mesopotamian cities, then Section 2 is about what those foundations created: hierarchy, power, and the endless struggle to keep chaos at bay. For in Mesopotamia, life was not simply lived, it was organized, counted, caked, and controlled. At the heart of every city stood its temple, the ziggurat. These towering stepped platforms were not built in a day, nor even a decade. They were projects of generations. Mud brick upon mud brick, carried and placed under the scorching sun, rising slowly above the flat plains. To climb a ziggurat's steps was to ascend closer to the gods. But more than a religious symbol, the temple was an economic hub. The temple owned land, fields, flocks, and employed workers, scribes, and priests, who received offerings and redistributed grain. The temple was a warehouse, a bank, and a labor office. The temple also represented stability. In a world of uncertain floods and fragile harvests, the gods had to be honored. Priests ensured that the rituals never ceased. Daily sacrifices, hymns sung, incense burned. To miss a ritual could mean disaster. The people did not see this as symbolic. They believed it was practical. To keep the gods fed and clothed, the ritual was to keep the city alive. But if the temple embodied order, it was also a place of bureaucracy. Scribes kept careful accounts of offerings. How many sheep, how much barley, how much beer. Each detail was pressed into clay tablets, then baked or dried. Entire rooms and temples served as archives, filled with shelves of clay records. Archaeologists today uncover these rooms, finding tablets stacked in neat piles, untouched for millennia. When we read them, we see mostly numbers, lists of rations, inventories of goods, debts, and credits. These were the lifeblood of the city. As cities grew, kings rose alongside priests. At first, kingship was temporary, a leader appointed in times of war. But by the early Bronze Age, kingship became permanent. The legalatory bit, yet even kings could not escape the practical needs of governance. They depended on scribes to record taxes, on officials to measure fields, on soldiers to enforce order. A king might commission a grand temple, but he also had to oversee irrigation. Canals, without water, without grain, there was no kingdom. The might of kingship rested not only on swords and chariots, but on ditches and dikes. Daily life, however, remained harsh. Workers owed labor to the temple or palace as part of their obligations. This corvée labor meant that ordinary men might spend weeks digging canals, hauling bricks, or transporting goods for the city. Payment often came in rations, measured amounts of barley, oil, or beer. Freedom was relative. Survival required submission to the larger order. Craftsmen fared somewhat better. Bronze workers, potters, weavers, and carpenters produced goods both for local use and for trade. Their skills were valuable, but their lives were still bound by the demands of temple and king. The city was not a free marketplace, but a managed system, with goods flowing in and out under tight supervision. Law began to emerge as another tool of order. The famous Code of Hammurabi, written centuries later in Babylon, has overshadowed earlier traditions. But already in Sumer, there were rules and judgments. Disputes over land, theft, or marriage required resolution. Judges, often elders or officials, listened, consulted written precedents, and issued verdicts. Justice was uneven, often favoring the powerful. But the idea that life needed to be regulated by laws, not just divine will, began here. Religion infused every corner of this order. People believed that their king ruled because the gods permitted it. They believed drought came when rituals failed, or when a god was offended. Wars were fought, not only for land, but for idols. To capture an enemy's god was to break their city. The pantheon was vast. Anu, god of the sky. Enlil, god of storms. Enki, god of wisdom and water. Cana, goddess of love and war. Each city had its patron deity, divine protector, whose favor was crucial. The myths of Mesopotamia reflected the anxieties of its people. One story tells of the flood, where gods decided to wipe out humanity, only to spare a single man, Utnapishtim, who built a boat. This tale, predating the biblical Noah, reveals a world where natural disaster was seen as divine punishment. Another myth, the descent of Inanna, tells of a goddess who entered the underworld, was stripped of power, and then restored. It is a story of loss, death, and renewal, echoing the cycles of harvest and drought. To live in Mesopotamia was to live under constant awareness of these cycles. When the harvest was good, the city thrived. When it failed, famine could strike quickly. There were no vast reserves, no global trade to fall back on. People relied on stored grain, on the measured rations distributed by officials. Hunger was never far away. Still, the system endured. Uruk grew into a metropolis by Bronze Age standards. Other cities flourished, each with its own temples, kings, and scribes. Together, they formed a patchwork of city-states, sometimes allied, often at war. Battles were fought with bronze-tipped spears, shields of leather and wood, and chariots pulled by donkeys or horses. War was common, but so were treaties. Clay tablets record alliances, marriage agreements between royal families, and exchanges of gifts. One striking feature of Mesopotamian life was its reliance on record-keeping. Even the most mundane details were preserved. We know how many fish were delivered to a temple kitchen, how many workers were assigned to dig a canal, how much wool a weaver produced in a year. It is in these details that we glimpse the ordinary lives of people long forgotten. For example, percent lists sometimes include women and children, showing that they too received measured amounts of barley or beer. Other tablets record slaves, identified only by their labor or value. A few rare inscriptions tell of disputes between neighbors or even complaints about unfair treatment. These fragments remind us that behind the great ziggurats and myths were ordinary people, negotiating survival within a system designed for control. The rhythm of Mesopotamian life, Dan, was one of balance between chaos and order. The rivers could flood too high or too little. The gods could bless or curse. Kings could rise or fall. Yet the cities continued, held together by bureaucracy, religion, and labor. But even this order was fragile. Around 2200 BCE, a great drought struck the region, disrupting harvests and weakening cities. Some were abandoned, others fell to invaders. The balance between human control and natural forces tipped, and entire civilizations suffered. Mesopotamia recovered in time, but the memory of fragility remained. So we are left to wonder, was this the price of civilization? To build cities and temples, to invent writing and law, but always to remain at the mercy of rivers, of climate, of unseen gods? And if so, was the order they created ever truly permanent, or only a temporary defense against the vast uncertainties of the world? Asterisk, if the first two sections have shown us how Mesopotamia's cities rose on the back of rivers, temples, and order, then this last section turns to what remains, the legacy, the decline, and the quiet endurance of a civilization that set patterns for all who followed. When archaeologists first began to dig into the Mesopotamian plains in the 19th century, they were astonished. What they found was not gold or marble, but clay. Thousands upon thousands of tablets, each impressed with wedge-shaped signs. To the casual observer, they might have seemed dull lists of sheep, deliveries of fish, inventories of beer, but to historians, they revealed the machinery of the world's first great cities. Civilization, it turned out, was built not on epic poetry alone, but on receipts. Clay was everywhere. Houses were made from it, bricks, sun-dried or kiln-fired. Tablets carried it in their inscriptions. Even toys were shaped from it, little clay animals for children to play with. And yet, because clay was fragile, much of Mesopotamian life has vanished. Roofs collapsed, walls eroded, floods carried entire neighborhoods away. What remains is fragmentary. We piece together their world from broken shards. Still, from these fragments, we see patterns that shaped history. Writing spread outward from Sumer to neighboring peoples. Systems of accounting and law were adopted and adapted. The very idea of a city, a dense center where rulers, priests, and markets controlled a hinterland, was born here. Later civilizations, from Babylon to Athens to Rome, would follow similar models. But even as Mesopotamian cities innovated, they also declined. Cities like Ur and Uruk rose to prominence, only to fall into obscurity. Why? Sometimes war destroyed them. Sometimes trade shifted, cutting off supplies of tin or copper. Sometimes drought or flood forced abandonment. The ruins we find today are often layers upon layers of rebuilding new temples erected atop old ones, new houses on the rubble of their predecessors. Ur, for instance, became a great city around 2100 BCE under the rule of Ur-Nammu. He built one of the largest ziggurats ever constructed, a massive platform rising above the plain. His law code, predating Hammurabi's, attempted to set out standards of justice. Yet, within a century, Ur was sacked by Elamite invaders. The city never regained its former glory. The pattern repeated again and again: growth, splendor, collapse, and still, people rebuilt. Civilization in Mesopotamia was never about permanence. It was about resilience, the capacity to rebuild in the face of loss. Floods destroyed fields, but canals were dug again. Cities fell, but new ones rose. Kings died, but their names lived on in tablets, their deeds carved into stones steely. The people of Mesopotamia understood that their world was fragile, but they also believed that by maintaining rituals, by honoring gods, by recording laws, they could keep order from slipping entirely into chaos. Ordinary people left fewer traces, but they too were part of this resilience. Farmers returned to fields after floods, rebuilt houses from mud brick, replanted crops, and began again. Women wove cloth, tended children, brewed. Meanwhile, in the common quarters, archaeologists found simple houses with grinding stones, ovens, and storage jars. These were not places of splendor, but of routine. Meals of barley bread and onions, tools worn down from daily use, burials. In courtyards, family members laid to rest beneath the floors of the homes where the living continued their work. The contrast between palace and house, tomb and hut, speaks volumes about the inequality of Mesopotamian society. And yet, through both grandeur and routine, Mesopotamia shaped the world. Writing, law, kingship, city life, irrigation all first developed here. Even the notion of history itself, the recording of events, began with their clay tablets. Before Mesopotamia, the past vanished when memories faded. After Mesopotamia, the past could be written, stored, and remembered. But for all its achievements, Mesopotamia reminds us of fragility. Civilizations that seemed eternal crumbled. Cities that seemed mighty fell into dust. Today, the ziggurats stand as eroded mounds, their bricks worn by wind and time. The rivers have shifted course, leaving once thriving cities stranded. What was once the center of the world is now barren land, scattered ruins half buried in sand. And so the question lingers: what remains of us will endure? Will our records, our cities, our temples of steel and glass survive millennia? Or will future archaeologists find only fragments, as we have of Mesopotamia receipts, broken vessels, the faint trace of lives once lived? The people of Mesopotamia believed their rituals could preserve order forever, But in the end, time wore down even the greatest of their works. What survives is not their power, nor their gods, but their records, the quiet marks of scribes pressing reeds into clay, never knowing that thousands of years later would still be reading their accounts of barley, beer, and sheep. And perhaps that is the true legacy, that history itself began with these people in their first cities, along their rivers, with their clay. A civilization both fragile and enduring, forgotten and yet remembered. Long before gleaming swords were decorated, helmets, humanity worked with stone. Stone tools shaped survival for hundreds of thousands of years: scrapers, blades, chipped from flint or obsidian. But stone had limits. It dulled quickly, it shattered, and it demanded constant sharpening. Around 5000 BCE, in scattered parts of the ancient world, people began to discover something different: metal. The first metal widely used was copper. Unlike iron, which required very high temperatures to smelt, copper could be extracted from, or at lower heats. Ancient communities found green-blue lumps of malachite or azurite on the surface of the earth, sometimes glinting in the sun. They learned, slowly, through experimentation, that these stones, when heated in fire, released a strange, malleable substance. This copper could be hammered into shape, bent, and sharpened. Unlike stone, it did not shatter. It was softer, but workable. At first, copper was rare and precious. Small awls, fish hooks, pins, or decorative beads were made from it. Tools and weapons were still primarily stone. But copper had opened a door, and humanity stepped through. Smelting hearths appeared in settlements from Anatolia to Iran. The knowledge spread, unevenly but steadily. Then, at some point, likely discovered by accident, copper was combined with another metal, tin. When smelters added tin or to copper in the furnace, the result was bronze, an alloy, harder, stronger, and more durable than either metal alone. Bronze could hold a sharper edge than copper and withstand more use than stone. The difference was dramatic. This discovery, perhaps around 3300 BCE, reshaped human societies. The Bronze Age had begun. It did not happen everywhere at once. Different regions entered it at different times, but the consequences were profound. Wherever it took hold, the production of bronze required resources. Copper and tin were not always found in the same places. Copper might be abundant in Cyprus, in Anatolia, or in Oman, while tin was rarer, appearing in pockets from Central Asia to Cornwall. To make bronze, societies needed trade. They needed networks that stretched across mountains, deserts, and seas. Suddenly, connections between distant lands were forged not simply by curiosity, but by necessity. Imagine the caravans moving through desert passes, donkeys laden with sacks of ore. Traders followed river routes, crossed barren plains, bartered in markets of distant cities. Ports bustled with ships carrying ingots of copper and tin. These trade routes were the veins through which the Bronze Age world pulsed. But what did bronze mean for daily life? In agriculture, bronze sickles allowed more efficient harvesting. Bronze plow tips could cut soil better than wood or stone. Farmers could cultivate more land, feed more people, sustain larger populations. In crafts, bronze chisels, saws, and hammers gave builders new tools for shaping wood and stone. In textiles, bronze needles and shears made work faster and more precise. And in war, bronze transformed conflict. Spears with bronze tips pierced deeper than sharpened wood. Bronze daggers and swords were deadlier than stone blades. Bronze armor and helmets gave protection unknown to earlier warriors. Chariots, armed with bronze fittings, allowed speed and maneuver in battle. Power shifted to those who controlled bronze. Kings, who could arm their soldiers with bronze weapons, gained dominance. Cities that controlled tin and copper trade grew wealthy. Yet bronze was not just about function. It became a symbol. Bronze vessels, decorated and cast with intricate designs, were used in rituals. Bronze statues of gods stood in temples, gleaming in firelight. To own bronze was to display wealth and status. It was not a material for everyone. Farmers still used wooden plows. Hunters still carried stone-tipped arrows. Bronze was expensive, controlled by elites, talks, and distributed through temples and palaces. The rise of bronze deepened social hierarchies. Rulers and priests monopolized access to the trade routes that supplied the metals. Workshops were often attached to palaces where craftsmen worked under supervision. Bronze objects became part of tribute and taxation. A farmer might hand over grain to a palace, which in turn used it to pay smiths who forged bronze tools. Control of bronze meant control of society. But bronze was also fragile in its own way. Its very existence depended on distant connections. If trade routes broke down, if tin or copper supplies were cut off, societies could falter. Archaeologists see evidence of this in the Great Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE, when many civilizations fell. But in its rise, bronze tied people together as never before. The technology of bronze making itself was complex. Smelters had to achieve high, steady heat in furnaces. Bellows pumped air to feed flames, or had to be crushed, sorted, and roasted. The proportions of tin and copper mattered. Too little tin and the alloy was weak. Too much and it was brittle. Craft knowledge was passed from generation to generation, guarded by smiths who understood the mysteries of fire and metal. In some places, bronze even shaped myth. The Greeks, much later, would speak of a Bronze Age race of men, strong and violent, who wielded bronze weapons. In China, the Shang dynasty cast massive bronze vessels, decorated with intricate designs of animals and spirits, used for offerings to ancestors. These were not just objects, they were connections between humans and the divine. So, the rise of bronze was not only a technological change, it was a social revolution. It brought trade, hierarchy, warfare, and ritual into new forms. It made possible larger, more complex societies. It reshaped economies and reshaped the very rhythms of daily life. And yet, as with Mesopotamia's cities, the question lingers, was this progress? Did bronze make life better for ordinary people, or only for the elites who controlled it? Did the farmer in his field truly benefit from bronze, or did he simply labor harder to supply the palace workshops? The gleam of bronze remains undeniable, but behind it lies the same old struggle of human history: survival, labor, inequality, equality, and the fragile threads that tie societies together. The magic of bronze did not lie only in the alloy itself, but in what it demanded: networks. To make bronze, societies had to reach beyond their own boundaries, to trade, to connect, to depend on strangers hundreds or even thousands of miles away. Copper was common in some regions, Cyprus, Anatolia, Oman, but tin was rare. Without tin, there was no bronze. And so the search for tin became one of the great drivers of early long-distance trade. Caravans set out across deserts and mountain passes, carrying donkeys loaded with sacks of ore. Along rivers, boats carried ingots of copper downstream, bound for cities that had none of their own. Across seas, ships plied the waters of the Aegean, the Levant, and beyond, their hulls filled with metal, ceramics, oil, and wine. The result was a web of interconnection that spanned the Bronze Age world. In the eastern Mediterranean, the city of Ugarit in modern Syria flourished as a hub where goods from Egypt, Anatolia, and Mesopotamia converged. Cyprus, rich in copper, became a vital supplier, its mines feeding workshops from Greece to the Near East. Farther afield, tin may have come from Central Asia, Iran, or even the distant mountains of Afghanistan. Some scholars argue that supplies also reached from as far as Cornwall in Britain, shipped through a chain of middlemen across Europe. This trade was not casual barter, but structured, regulated, often monopolized by kings and palaces. In Mycenaean Greece, palace administrators recorded the movement of bronze, grain, and wool on clay tablets in linear B script. In Egypt, pharaohs, officials managed shipments of copper and tin arriving by sea. In Mesopotamia, merchants signed contracts, recorded debts, and used seals to authenticate shipments. The flow of metals bound these distant worlds together, but with trade came power. Cities that controlled trade routes grew rich. Kingdoms that secured access to copper or tin mines could arm their armies, build monumental temples, and assert dominance over neighbors. The Hittites of Anatolia, for instance, rose to power partly by controlling access to key resources, the chips. Wealth was tied not only to the Nile, but also to the metals and luxury goods that flowed through its ports. For ordinary people, this meant that bronze objects entered daily life slowly, unevenly. A farmer might still use a wooden plow with only a bronze tip at its end. A soldier might carry a bronze spearhead, but his armor, if he had any at all, was leather. Bronze was expensive. Its use was rationed, distributed, controlled by elites. The palace gave tools to workers, weapons to soldiers, vessels to priests. Ownership was rarely private. Bronze was part of a managed economy, yet the presence of bronze was felt in countless ways. In agriculture, bronze sickles harvested grain more efficiently, enabling surpluses that fed larger populations. In crafts, bronze chisels carved stone. More finely, bronze saws cut timber for ships and buildings. Bronze needles stitched garments more tightly. Key and simple household items, pens, bracelets, mirrors were made of bronze, adding small gleams of metal to ordinary lives. The prestige of bronze extended into religion. In the Shang dynasty of China, enormous bronze vessels weighing hundreds of pounds were cast in intricate forms of animals and spirits. These vessels were used in ancestor rituals filled with offerings of food and drink. The labor to create them was immense mining or smelting, casting in piece molds, but the result was a sacred object that bound the living to the dead. To the Shang elite, bronze was not only power but connection to the spirit world. In Mesopotamia and Egypt, too, bronze played a ritual role. Temples held bronze statues of gods, offerings in bronze bowls, tools for sacrifices forged from bronze. To shine with bronze was to show devotion, wealth, and permanence. Even though the gods themselves were unseen, their presence was marked by gleaming metal and candlelight. Bronze also shaped diplomacy. Kings exchanged bronze objects as gifts, along with gold, ivory, and textiles. Letters preserved on clay tablets like those from the Amarna archives in Egypt show rulers requesting shipments of copper and tin, offering daughters in marriage, or complaining about delayed deliveries. International politics of the Bronze Age often revolved around access to resources. A king without bronze could not defend his borders, could not maintain his authority, could not keep rivals at bay, but dependence carried risk. The more connected the Bronze Age world became, the more fragile it grew. A drought in Anatolia, a rebellion in a trade hub, a shipwreck in the Aegean disruption could ripple across the system. Without tin, bronze production stalled. Without copper, workshops went silent. The very networks that gave society strength also made them vulnerable. Archaeology offers glimpses of this interconnected world. The Uluburun shipwreck, discovered off the coast of Turkey and dated to the 14th century BCE, carried a cargo that reads like a catalog of the Bronze Age economy: copper, ingots, glass beads, ivory, precious woods, pottery, even luxury goods like ostrich eggs. The ship's cargo suggests networks stretching from the Near East to Africa to Europe. It was not a lone vessel, but part of a vast system of trade that kept the Bronze Age alive. The story of bronze, then, is not only about metallurgy, it is about trust, exchange, and interdependence. It is about kingdoms negotiating alliances, merchants traveling vast distances, and ordinary workers mining or in mountains they would never leave. It is about the way metal tied human lives together, from Afghanistan to Egypt, from Anatolia to Greece. And yet, this dependence raises an inevitable question. If bronze required such delicate connections, what happened when those connections broke? Could the very strength of the Bronze Age, the web of trade, power, and ritual also, have been its weakness? Asterisk. The Bronze Age dazzles us with its innovations, but every advance carried its cost. To wield bronze was to depend on distant mines, fragile trade routes, and the authority of kings who claimed control of it. For centuries, This system flourished, but like all systems, it could not last forever. By around 1200 BCE, the Bronze Age world stretched from Egypt and Mesopotamia to Greece and Anatolia. Great kingdoms traded and warred, built temples and palaces, raised armies with bronze-tipped spears and chariots. And then, within a century, many of them collapsed. Palaces burned, cities emptied, records ceased. Archaeologists call this the Bronze Age collapse, a mystery still debated today. What caused it? Likely not one single factor, but many converging. Some regions suffered prolonged drought, disrupting harvests. Famine followed, weakening populations and states. Others faced invasions. Migrating groups, remembered vaguely as the Sea Peoples, swept across the Mediterranean, raiding and settling. Trade routes faltered. Without tin and copper, bronze production slowed. Without bronze, armies and economies weakened further. In this sense, bronze's strength was also its weakness. It required connections across vast distances. And those connections frayed, the societies built upon them crumbled. Palaces, once filled with bronze vessels, became ruins. Temples that had gleamed with metal ornaments lay silent. The great chariot armies were defeated, their bronze fittings scattered in the dust. For ordinary people, the collapse meant hardship. Farmers returned to smaller, local systems of subsistence. Without palaces to redistribute goods, life became more isolated in many places. Literacy declined. The careful records of bronze shipments and rations, once pressed daily into clay, disappeared. The world became smaller, simpler, harsher, and yet, even in collapse, resilience persisted. Communities did not vanish entirely. They rebuilt in new forms, turned to iron, a metal once ignored because it required hotter furnaces to smelt. Iron was less glamorous at first. Its quality was inconsistent, its working more difficult. But it had one advantage. It was abundant. Unlike tin, iron ore could be found in many places. Societies no longer needed to depend on fragile trade for a rare resource. The Iron Age emerged slowly, unevenly, but it transformed the balance of power. Kings who mastered iron gained new strength. Ordinary farmers could, over time, access stronger tools. The world moved on, but the legacy of bronze remained. Bronze had done more than supply weapons or tools. It had tied together distant lands, fostered trade, and deepened hierarchies. It had given rise to palaces, to armies, to rituals of gleaming metal. It had pushed humanity beyond the local into networks that spanned continents. The very idea of an interconnected world traces back, in part, to bronze. Archaeology continues to reveal this legacy. In graves, bronze, daggers, and jewelry remind us of status once displayed. In temples, fragments of bronze vessels hint at rituals long forgotten. Corroded ingots show us the lifeblood of ancient trade. Each artifact tells a story not only of innovation, but of dependence, fragility, and change. And perhaps that is the lesson of bronze. It was never permanent. It was a stage, a chapter in human history. For centuries, it shaped the rhythms of life, what people ate, how they farmed, how they fought, how they worshipped. Then, like all things, it passed. But in passing, it laid foundations. Writing, cities, laws, and trade, all strengthened by the Bronze Age, continued into the Iron Age and beyond. For the people who lived through it, bronze was not an age, but a reality. It was the weight of a plow in the hand, the gleam of a vessel on the altar, the edge of a spear in battle. It was hard labor in mines, long journeys along caravan routes, the endless administration of palace scribes. It was survival, struggle, order, and fragility bound in metal. So we are left to reflect. Was bronze progress, or was it burden? Did it enrich humanity, or entangle it in dependencies that made collapse inevitable. And when we look at our own world, so dependent on rare resources and global trade, can we see in the rise and fall of bronze a faint mirror of ourselves? Asterisk, to understand the Bronze Age, it is the day's labor begins with water. Irrigation is life in the Bronze Age. The farmer checks the canals, earthen ditches dug from the main river, carrying water to the fields. Sometimes these canals are silted, blocked by debris, or broken by floods. Repairing them is constant work. With wooden shovels tipped in bronze, he clears channels, making sure water flows evenly. Too much water, and the crops drown. It's too little, and they wither. The main crop is barley, hardy and resilient. It grows even in salty soils, unlike wheat, which struggles. The farmer scatters seed by hand, walking steadily across the furrows. Later, when stalks rise, he weeds carefully, pulling unwanted plants with his hands or a simple hoe. His children chase birds away with clapping sticks, shouting to protect the grain. Barley is more than food, it is survival. From barley comes bread, porridge, and beer. Beer is thick, nutritious, and safer than river water. It is brewed in clay jars, drunk through straws to avoid the bitter husks that float on the surface. Workers in temples, soldiers in armies, even children drink beer daily. For many places, wages are paid in measures of barley or beer, not coins. For the farmer, the field is not just labor, it's currency. Alongside barley, there are vegetables, onions, leeks, garlic, lentils. Dates are gathered from palms where the climate allows. Goats provide milk, sheep give wool, oxen pull the plow. Chickens are not yet common, but ducks and geese waddle in the courtyards. The farmer's life is a careful balance of crops and animals, each supporting the other. Tools are simple but effective. The plow, still mostly wooden, cuts furrows in the soil, sometimes tipped with bronze for durability. Sickles for harvesting are fitted with bronze blades, sharper and longer lasting than stone. Grinding stones sit in every household where women and daughters spend hours crushing grain into flour. Bronze made some tasks easier, but it did not remove the drudgery. A day's work remained long, repetitive, and exhausting. Seasons dictate everything. Planting after the floods, weeding as the stalks grow, harvesting under a punishing sun, threshing the grain by beating it with sticks, winnowing it in the wind. Each stage demands labor. There are no days off, no pauses. A failed harvest means hunger, perhaps famine. The farmer cannot afford mistakes. And yet, even in this routine, there is community. Neighbors share canals, work together to repair dikes, thresh grain in groups. Festivals mark the planting and the harvest, times when offerings are made to the gods, asking for fertile fields and protection from storms. The temple demands its share of the crop, collected by officials who measure grain in baskets or jars. What remains feeds the family, with luck enough stored for the winter months. The farmer's children grow up in this rhythm. Boys learn to plow, to manage animals, to dig canals. Girls learn to grind grain, weave wool, fetch water, brew beer. Childhood is short. By early adolescence, they labor as adults. Marriage comes young, often arranged within the village. The family remains the central unit of survival, bound to the land, bound to each other. Archaeology reveals these lives through small traces. Grinding stones worn smooth by decades of use. Clay jars still stained with barley beer. Storage pits dug beneath houses, filled with charred grain from ancient fires. Skeletons showing signs of hard labor, bent spines, worn joints, teeth ground down by coarse bread, filled with grit from stone mills. These are not the monuments of kings, but the quiet evidence of lives sustained by work. Disease is common. Water carries sickness. Insects spread fevers. Malnutrition weakens bodies. Life expectancy is short, many dying before 40. Infant mortality is high. Mothers often buried children in small graves beneath the house floor, then continued their labor the next day. Yet, families endure. The rhythm continues. Religion touches every act. Before planting, offerings are made to the gods of fertility. During harvest, prayers thank the deities of sun and rain. Clay figurines of protective spirits are buried at the edges of fields, guardians against blight or flood. For the farmer, the gods are not distant abstractions. They are present in every stalk of barley, every drop of water. But always, the question lingers, was life better with bronze? Did the farmer, bending over his field under a hot sun, feel any relief from the gleam of this new alloy? Or was bronze a tool of kings and temples, its benefits trickling down slowly, while the farmer's labor remained as relentless as it had been in the Stone Age? The farmer rises at dawn, tills, plants, harvests, and sleeps on his mat at night, his body sore, his work unending. The city grows, the palace thrives, the temple gleams, but it is his hands, in the hands of millions like him, that make it possible. And so, we might ask, when we speak of the Bronze Age, do we mean the age of kings and warriors? Or, truly, the age of farmers, the silent majority who carried civilization on their backs? Asterisk. The farmer's world was one of endless cycles, but it was never entirely his own. His fields belonged not just to his family, but to a larger system of controlled temple palace or local lords who demanded their share of the harvest. In the Bronze Age, agriculture was not only about survival, it was about obligation. Each year, when the barley harvest was complete, temple officials arrived. They carried clay tablets, reed styluses, and measuring baskets with careful precision. They counted and recorded the grain due as tithes or tithe. Farmers lined up with their sacks, pouring grain into storage jars or granaries. Some of this grain was redistributed as wages, feeding laborers who dug canals or built temples. Some was reserved for soldiers or craftsmen. Much went to support the priests and rituals that maintained divine favor. For the farmer, this meant that his harvest was divided before his family even touched it. A portion went to the temple, a portion to the palace, if one existed, but what remained had to last until the next harvest, food for daily meals, seed for the next planting, fodder for animals. In good years, there was enough. In bad years, the family went hungry. Labor obligations went beyond grain. Farmers were often required to perform corvée labor and paid work for the state. This might mean digging canals, hauling bricks for construction, or transporting goods. When summoned, a farmer left his family to labor for weeks or months under official supervision. While away, his wife and children managed the household and fields, taking on burdens that stretched them thin. Despite this, the system endured. The farmer knew his place in it. His identity was bound to land, family, and community. He could not imagine a life without fields or canals, without the temple's shadow or the city's reach. To farm was not a choice, but a necessity, a role, inherited from generations before him. Daily tasks were monotonous but precise. At dawn, he led oxen to the plow, guiding them with calls and whips. Furrows stretched in neat lines, the soil turning under the blade. Later, he waded into canals to clear silt, his legs coated with mud. In harvest season, he swung a bronze sickle through barley stalks, sweating under the sun, while children followed behind, gathering bundles. In the courtyard at night, the family threshed grain, beating stalks against the ground to loosen seeds, then winnowed in the wind, tossing grain into the air to let chaff drift away. Meals were simple, repetitive, but sustaining. Bread was flat, coarse, often baked on hot stones or in clay ovens. Ghee was thick, sour, and filling, consumed daily. Onions, garlic, and lentils added variety when available. Meat was rare, reserved for festivals or sacrifices. Milk from goats or sheep provided occasional relief, but most calories came from barley. Archaeological remains confirm this monotony. Bones of laborers show wear from hard work, arthritic joints, fractured spines, evidence of malnutrition. Teeth, ground down by gritty bread, revealed that even sustenance carried hidden costs. Grinding stones shed small particles of stone into flour, which slowly wore enamel. Bronze tools eased some burdens, but introduced new ones. Sickles cut faster, but they dulled and required constant sharpening. Plowshares were stronger, but they broke and had to be repaired. Bronze was valuable, and tools were often controlled by temples or palaces loaned to farmers who could not afford to own them outright. Thus, dependence deepened. The farmer was never free from larger structures of power. And yet, despite hardships, the farmer's life contained moments of rhythm and joy. Festivals marked the agricultural calendar with music, dancing, and feasting. Weddings brought families together, weaving social bonds. Storytellers recited myths of gods and heroes by firelight, offering both entertainment and lessons. Children played with clay toys, simple but cherished. The farmer lived close to the earth, but also close to history. His labor built the foundation for temples, fed the armies of kings. It sustained the scribes who recorded the first laws. He himself may not have read or written, but his sweat filled the tablets of bureaucrats. His grain fed the elites, who claimed divine favor. Still, we must ask, did he feel the weight of this order? Did he see the temple as protector or oppressor? Did he pray with devotion or with weary resignation, knowing that his gods demanded much but offered little certainty? The tablets do not tell us. His voice is silent. Only the traces of his labor remain. And so the farmer continues his cycle digging, planting, harvesting, offering, enduring. His life was ordinary, uncelebrated, forgotten by name. Yet without him, the Bronze Age would have been nothing more than empty palaces and barren temples. Civilization rested on his shoulders, and he bore it quietly. The Bronze Age farmer rarely appeared in the inscriptions of kings, protected the carvings of temples, or the records of scribes. His life passed mostly unnoticed, save for occasional entries in ration lists or tax accounts. Yet, if we strip away the palaces and battles, it is his world that carried civilization. The legacy of the Bronze Age rests not in monuments alone, but in the quiet persistence of those who bent their backs in the fields after harvest. The farmer's year shifted from toil in the fields to storing and guarding the crop. Granaries were sealed with clay stoppers, some marked with the impression of a seal to indicate ownership or temple authority. Families stored grain in jars within their homes, tucking them into corners or burying them in pits beneath floors. Rats and insects were constant threats, and so families checked the jars daily, listening for the faint sounds of gnawing or the flutter of wings. Some surplus, when it existed, was traded. In village markets, farmers bartered grain for pottery, tools, or cloth. Bronze was rare among them, but small object spins, knives, ornaments could sometimes be acquired through exchange. The great trade in tin and copper flowed far above the farmer's head, managed by kings and merchants, but at its edges, tiny fragments trickled down to ordinary people. Seasons framed existence. After planting and harvest came the lull of winter, when the land rested and families spent more time indoors. Fires burned low, children listened to stories told by elders, and weaving occupied many long hours. Wool from sheep became garments, spun and dyed with natural colors. Women's labor in spinning and weaving was as vital as men's work in fields. Together, they maintained the fragile equilibrium of survival. Death was never far away. Families often buried their dead close to home. In Mesopotamia, skeletons have been found beneath house floors, wrapped in mats or placed in jars. These burials suggest a continuity between the living and the dead. The household carried on above, while ancestors rested below. Offerings of food and small figurines sometimes accompanied the dead, tokens of care and remembrance. In other regions, such as the Indus Valley, cemeteries lay outside towns, rows of simple graves marking the passage of countless unnamed lives. What strikes archaeologists is the sameness of it all. For centuries, the tools, houses, and diets of farmers changed little. Innovation in bronze and trade enriched elites, but for the farmer, life remained steady, repetitive. Progress was not felt in leaps, but in small adjustments. A sharper sickle, a sturdier plow, a new canal dug by communal labor. Civilization advanced, yet the farmer's hands carried on the same motions generation after generation. We might think this dullness a kind of stagnation, but it was also stability. The rhythms of planting and harvest created order in an uncertain world. The farmer did not expect freedom from toil. He sought only enough rain, enough grain, enough health for his children to see another season. To endure was to succeed, and yet, though uncelebrated, the farmer left his mark. The very landscapes of the Bronze Age were reshaped by his labor. Canals stretched across plains, altering rivers. Terraces cut into hillsides bore witness 2 years of cultivation. Fields expanded, forests cleared, soils salted by irrigation. Even when cities fell, the traces of farmland remained. Archaeologists today still find the outlines of ancient fields beneath desert sands. Faint ridges of furrows carved by oxen thousands of years ago. The farmer's contribution also lived in culture. Myths of fertility, of gods who died and were reborn, reflected agricultural cycles. Festivals tied to planting and harvest were the heart of community life. Even the earliest laws, such as those of Yanamu and Hammurabi, devoted long sections to land disputes, irrigation rights, and crop failures. The farmer's struggles shaped the very frameworks of law and religion. His body, too, bore testimony. Skeletal remains show arthritis in knees and backs, worn spines from lifting and bending. Broken bones healed poorly, teeth ground down to stubs from gritty bread. These are the signatures of labor etched into bone. They tell us that survival was not gentle, yet they also tell us that survival was achieved again and again for centuries. The farmer's voice is absent in text, but perhaps that absence itself is telling. He did not write because he had no need or no permission. His legacy was not in words, but in continuity. Every harvest fed the next generation, and every repaired canal kept the water flowing. Every seed planted carried forward a world that might otherwise have collapsed. And so, when we speak of the Bronze Age, we must imagine not just gleaming swords or towering ziggurats, but mornings in the fields, sweat on the brow, the creak of the plow, the laughter of children chasing birds from crops. Civilization stood on these shoulders, but we might ask, in all our fascination with kings and warriors, why do we forget the farmer? Why does history preserve the names of rulers, but not the names of those who fed them? And if our own societies depend on invisible laborers in fields and factories, will they to be forgotten? Their stories buried beneath the weight of monuments and records of elites. The Bronze Age farmer did not ask these questions. He woke. He labored. He slept. He endured. Yet, in his endurance, he created the very world we now study. His legacy lies not in glory, but in survival. And perhaps that is the truest foundation of history. Asterisk, the Bronze Age. For all its innovations depended on 2 metals, copper and tin. Without them, there was no bronze, no stronger tools, no sharper weapons, no glittering ritual vessels. Yet, these 2 metals were rarely found together in nature. Copper existed in abundance across many lands, from Cyprus to Anatolia, from Oman to the Sinai. Tin, however, was elusive, scattered in small, remote deposits, often far from the centers of civilization. This imbalance meant that Bronze Age societies were tied together by trade. Copper and tin had to move across deserts, along rivers, overseas. Caravans, ships, and merchants became the unseen arteries of the age, carrying the lifeblood of bronze from distant mines to palace workshops and temple smithies. Without these networks, the Bronze Age would not have existed. Imagine the copper mines of Cyprus. Workers hacked at rock with stone hammers and bronze picks, dragging ore from the earth. The ore was crushed, smelted in furnaces fueled by charcoal, then cast into ingots. These ingots, often shaped like oxides for easier transport, were stacked onto ships bound for the Levant. From there, caravans carried them inland to cities that had no copper of their own. Meanwhile, tin came from faraway lands. Its sources were scattered: the mountains of Central Asia, the deserts of Iran and Afghanistan, the highlands of Anatolia, perhaps even the distant hills of Cornwall in Britain. Tin was so scarce that its supply defined the reach of Bronze Age networks. Where tin flowed, bronze flourished. Where it did not, societies faltered. Asterix trade was not a casual affair. It was organized, recorded, and controlled by elites. Palaces kept scribes who tracked shipments on clay tablets. Merchants carried seals to mark their goods, contracts to secure their exchanges. Taxes and tribute were levied on caravans passing through kingdoms. A king who controlled a trade route held power not just over goods, but over the destinies of other lands. These routes were dangerous. Caravans crossing deserts risked thirst, bandits, and storms. Ships braving the seas risked wreckage on rocky coasts. Merchants depended on hospitality, on alliances. For the ordinary trader, life was precarious. Donkeys groaned under heavy loads of ore, walking dusty tracks for weeks at a time. Merchants bartered in markets with foreign tongues, weighing goods on balanced scales. Payment came in silver, in grain, in wool, in whatever each region valued. The journey was long, the profit uncertain, but the demand for bronze made it worthwhile. The Aluburan shipwreck, discovered off the coast of Turkey, offers a rare glimpse into this world. Dated to the 14th century BCE, its cargo contained 10 tons of copper ingots, a ton of tin, and luxury goods from across the Bronze Age world. Ivory from Africa, glass beads from Egypt, amber from the Baltic. This single ship carried the interconnected world of its time within its hold. Its sinking reminds us how fragile these networks were, how easily one storm could erase months of labor, disrupt the flow of metal, and ripple across economies. But trade was not just about materials. Alongside copper and tin traveled ideas, languages, and technologies. Merchants carried stories of distant lands, introduced new styles of pottery or weaving, spread myths and rituals. The Bronze Age was not isolated pockets of culture, but a world tied together by the constant movement of people and goods. Still, dependence on trade created vulnerability. If a tin mine was exhausted, if a caravan was blocked by war, if a sea lane was disrupted by pirates, entire regions suffered. Palaces that once gleamed with bronze vessels could suddenly find themselves short of supplies. Armies that relied on bronze weapons could weaken, their power diminished. And so, when we trace the roots of copper and tin, we are tracing the skeleton of the Bronze Age itself. These roots determined which kingdoms rose and which fell, which cities prospered and which faded. They revealed not only the richness of connection, but also the fragility of dependence. We might then ask, bronze relied so heavily on these metals. How much of the Bronze Age was truly built on certainty, and how much was balanced on the thin, shifting lines of trade. Asterisk, to follow the trade of copper and tin is to follow the footsteps of merchants whose lives were as restless as the rivers and winds they depended on. Unlike the farmer, tied to his fields, the merchant's world stretched outward across deserts, mountains, and seas, linking lands that might otherwise have remained strangers. Caravans were the backbone of overland trade. Imagine the sight: a long file of donkeys, each carrying sacks of ore or bundles of wool, their hooves stirring up clouds of dust along narrow desert tracks. Merchants walked beside them, leading, coaxing, guarding. Carts often traveled along, for bandits preyed on the weak and the slow. Campsites were made under the stars, where traders huddled around small fires, eating flatbread and dates while guarding their loads through the night. The journey was slow, but necessary. From the mountains of Afghanistan, tin traveled westward, crossing harsh passes, moving into Mesopotamia. From Anatolia's mines, copper descended into fertile valleys. Cyprus, ships ferried copper ingots to Levantan ports, where they were loaded onto caravans bound inland. These routes were arteries of civilization, and the merchants were their lifeblood. Merchants were not always independent wanderers. Many worked on behalf of palaces or temples, acting as agents for kings and priests. Contracts preserved on clay tablets show agreements between merchants and officials. How much metal was to be delivered, at what time, under what conditions. Seals marked with distinctive symbols ensured authenticity. These were the safeguards of a world where distance made trust fragile. Trade was not only metals. Wool from Mesopotamia traveled alongside copper, olive oil and wine from the Aegean crossed seas with tin. Luxury items, ivory, lapis lazuli, amber flowed with the metals, creating a web of exchange that carried both necessity and prestige. Bronze may have been the engine, but its trade pulled countless other goods in its wake. The rewards could be great. Successful merchants gained wealth, status, and influence, so became almost like diplomats, negotiating with foreign rulers, arranging marriages between elite families, securing treaties that allowed safe passage. Others settled abroad, establishing trading colonies in distant lands. In Eucrit, a bustling port in Syria, archives reveal merchants corresponding in multiple languages, fluent in the tongues of Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Anatolia. These men lived between worlds, their lives defined by movement. Yet, the risks were just as great. A caravan lost to raiders meant ruin. A shipwreck meant financial collapse. Merchants gambled with every journey, and many lost. Archaeological records are silent about those who vanished on roads or seas, their names forgotten. For every wealthy trader, there were many who carried debts, who mortgaged their homes or families to fund a journey, only to return with nothing. Still, the demand for bronze kept them moving. Palaces required weapons for armies, temples demanded vessels for rituals, and elites sought ornaments to display power. The flow of copper and tin became the measure of wealth. Cities thrived or withered, depending on whether merchants could deliver. The Aluburan shipwreck illustrates this vividly. On board were not only copper and tin, but also glass ingots, ostrich eggs, ivory tusks, jewelry, scarabs from Egypt, and weapons. This was not a cargo for a single buyer, but a floating marketplace, a condensed version of the interconnected world. To lose such a ship was to lose not only wealth, but a thread in the network that bound kingdoms together. Merchants also carried ideas, writing systems, weights and measures, religious symbols all spread through their journeys. A trader arriving in a foreign port might tell stories of distant gods, show objects made in unfamiliar styles, introduce new methods of accounting. Through them, cultures mingled. Trade was not only the exchange of goods, but the exchange of knowledge. For ordinary people, the impact of trade was less visible, but still felt. Farmers rarely saw the caravans or ships, but their grain fed the workers who mined copper. Their wool was exchanged for metals. Their labor produced the surplus that made trade possible. Bronze tools might eventually reach their hands, but slowly, and often controlled by elites. The wealth of trade enriched kings first, then merchants, then priests. For the farmer or craftsman, its benefits were indirect. Yet, even if he never saw a tin ingot, the farmer lived in a world shaped by trade. His tools, his plows, his sickle sieve, tipped with bronze were the end products of journeys that spanned continents. His temple, adorned with bronze ornaments, was a monument to distant mines. Even the weapons that defended his city owed their sharpness to caravans moving across deserts he would never cross. The fragility of these roots was always apparent. A drought in Anatolia might reduce copper production. Conflict in Syria might close ports. Storm at sea might sink a cargo. Each disruption echoed across the network. Palaces hoarded reserves, temples prayed for safe passage, merchants recalculated risks. The system worked only as long as its threads remained unbroken. And so we are left to consider, were these merchants the true architects of the Bronze Age? Without their constant movement, bronze would have remained a curiosity, never shaping civilizations. Kings commanded armies, priests led rituals, but merchants carried the means to make both possible. Their journeys dangerous, thankless, often. Forgotten were the foundation of the age itself. But what happened when those journeys faltered? When the flow of copper and tin slowed? When caravans ceased? When ships no longer reached port? What then became of the Bronze Age world, so dependent on them? It's asterisk by the late 2nd millennium BCE. The networks that carried copper and tin stretched like a web across continents, from the deserts of Central Asia to the harbors of the Aegean, from the mines of Cyprus to the valleys of Mesopotamia. Merchants and caravans sustained the very heart of Bronze Age civilization. But no web, however intricate, is indestructible. The collapse of the Bronze Age around 1200 BCE revealed just how fragile these threads were. Palaces that had once tracked shipments of copper ingots fell silent. Cities that had bustled with merchants were reduced to ruins. Ships ceased to sail, caravans ceased to pass, and the constant hum of exchange faded into silence. Why did this happen? Scholars debate endlessly. Perhaps drought struck, drying rivers and withering crops, forcing communities into famine. Caps. Invasions by migrating peoples, the so-called Sea Peoples disrupted coastal trade. Perhaps political rivalries cut off key routes, or internal rebellions weakened palaces from within. Likely, it was all of these converging at once. The system that had grown so vast depended on stability. When instability came, the system broke. Tin, always rare, became scarcer still. Without tin, there was no bronze. Without bronze, armies lost their edge. Farmers lost durable tools. Temples lost their gleaming symbols. The very name Bronze Age suggests how central these metals were. When their flow ended, so too did the age. And yet, collapse. It was in this vacuum that iron began to rise. Unlike tin, iron ore was abundant, keen. It did not require long, fragile routes across deserts and seas. Keen, but working iron was harder red, needed higher temperatures, better furnaces, more knowledge. Slowly, unevenly, societies adapted, and with iron came a new age, one less dependent on distant trade, one reshaped by new powers. Still, the memory of bronze endured. Myths spoke of earlier ages when men of bronze walked the earth, strong and violent. Ruins of palaces built with wealth from copper and tin remained on landscapes long after the merchants had gone. Archaeologists today uncovered their traces: oxide, ingots corroded green, tin beads scattered in graves, shipwrecks whose cargoes silently testified to the vast distances once bridged. The Aluburan shipwreck, It's one such memory preserved by chance. It's cargo copper from Cyprus, tin from the East, glass, ivory. Amber tells us that the Bronze Age world was not isolated kingdoms, but a shared network. It shows that even 3,000 years ago, people depended on strangers in distant lands for the very tools of their survival. But it also warns us, for dependence carries vulnerability. The Bronze Age flourished because of trade, and it collapsed because that trade could not be sustained. The very thing that gave it strength also made it fragile. For the farmer in Mesopotamia, the collapse may have seemed simple. Perhaps his bronze-tipped plow broke and no replacement came. Perhaps soldiers demanded grain but lacked weapons to defend his village. For the craftsman, the collapse may have meant the disappearance of tin, leaving only copper, two soft, two-shaped, strong tools. For the merchant, it meant the end of journeys, the silence of roads once busy with caravans. And yet, even in collapse, there is legacy. The roots carved by merchants did not vanish entirely. Later traders in iron and beyond followed many of the same paths. The Silk Road, centuries later, echoed the east-west connections forged in the Bronze Age. Mediterranean trade, though reshaped, still bore traces of earlier patterns. The Bronze Age may have ended, but its pathways left grooves in history. So when we study the trade of copper and tin, we are not only studying metals, we are studying connection itself, the need of human societies to reach outward, to exchange, to depend, to weave networks greater than themselves. We are studying both the brilliance and the fragility of those networks, and perhaps the question lingers, are we, too, not bound by similar threads today, dependent on distant minds, fragile roots, unseen merchants? Do we not live, in some sense, in our own Bronze Age, strong yet vulnerable, brilliant yet fragile, carried by the same delicate web of trade? Asterisk, far out in the blue waters of the eastern Mediterranean, on the island of Crete, rose one of the most enigmatic cultures of the Bronze Age, the Minoans. The keen, given much later by modern scholars, comes from the legendary king Minos, keen, but their true identity remains wrapped in mystery. What survives are ruins, vast palaces, intricate frescoes, and fragments of writing still undeciphered. Among these, none is more famous than the Palace of Knossos. Unlike the mud-brick cities of Mesopotamia or the monumental temples of Egypt, Knossos seems almost dreamlike. It's built around 1900 BCE and expanded over centuries. It sprawled across several acres, multiple levels, staircases, storerooms, workshops, and living quarters, created a labyrinth of halls. To walk its corridors was to enter a maze. Perhaps the origin of later myths of the labyrinth and the Minotaur. The walls of Knossos were covered in frescoes bright. Vivid paintings of dolphins leaping through waves, of bull leapers vaulting, overcharging animals, of women in elaborate dresses with flounced skirts and open bodices, men bearing offerings, of processions winding toward altars. These images suggest a culture unlike the warrior kings of Mesopotamia or Egypt. Here, color and movement, ritual and play seemed central. The palace was not just a royal residence. It was an administrative hub, a storage center, a religious site. Vast storerooms held giant clay jars, pithosum, taller than a man, filled with oil, grain, wine, or honey. Workshops produced pottery, jewelry, and textiles. Courtyards hosted rituals, perhaps athletic contests or dances tied to religious festivals. Temples, shrines, and altars connected the palace to the divine. Knossos also reveals a society deeply tied to the sea. Crete lies at a crossroads of the eastern Mediterranean, between Greece, Anatolia, and Egypt. Ships sailed from its harbors, carrying pottery and goods, returning with metals and luxuries. The Minoans were seafarers, traders, and perhaps even naval powers. Their influence spread across the Aegean, leaving Minoan-style pottery in distant islands and coastal towns. Daily life, though less visible, can be glimpsed through these remains. Farmers cultivated olives and grapes, tended flocks of sheep and goats, and grew barley and wheat. Their labor filled the storerooms of Knossos, supporting the palace and its rituals. Craftsmen shaped clay into the distinctive Minoan pottery elegant, often decorated with spirals, marine creatures, or floral patterns. Metalworkers forged bronze tools and ornaments. Women played prominent roles, at least in art, shown as priestesses, dancers, or participants in rituals. Yet, much remains unclear. The Minoans left behind two scripts, known as Linear A and Linear B. Linear B was later adapted by Mycenaean Greeks and has been deciphered, revealing inventories of goods and names. But Linear A remains unreadable. The very words of the Minoans are lost, leaving us to reconstruct their world through architecture, art, and artifacts. Religion seems to have centered on goddesses, often associated with animals, fertility, and nature. Snake figurines found in Knossos suggest rituals tied to renewal and power. Shrines carved into caves or mountaintops indicate a connection to the natural world. Yet, without texts, we can only guess at their myths, their prayers, their beliefs. Knossos was also fragile. Built on an island prone to earthquakes, it was damaged and rebuilt several times. Around 1450 BCE, it was devastated, perhaps by natural disaster, perhaps by invasion from the Mycenaeans of mainland Greece. By 1375 BCE, the palace was abandoned, its labyrinth silent, its frescoes fading, still. Its memory endured centuries. Later, Greeks told stories of King Minos, of the Minotaur hidden in a labyrinth, of Theseus and Ariadne. These myths may echo dimly the grandeur and complexity of Knossos, what archaeologists see as storerooms and staircases. Ancient storytellers remembered as mazes and monsters. The palace, today, is partly reconstructed by early archaeologist Arthur Evans, remains both real and elusive. Visitors walk its restored halls, climb its staircases, see replicas of its frescoes. But beneath the modern concrete and painted walls lies the puzzle of a civilization whose voice is lost. And so we must ask, what was Knossos truly? A palace of kings, a temple of goddesses, a marketplace, a labyrinth of power? Or was it all of these at once? A place where politics, religion, economy, and art merged into one great structure. Asterisk, if the first glimpse of Knossos reveals its dazzling frescoes and sprawling architecture, the second look uncovers its role as the beating heart of a culture that blended ritual, power, and daily labor in ways still not fully understood. Unlike the monumental pyramids of Egypt or the rigid ziggurats of Mesopotamia, Knossos feels fluid, almost theatrical. Every hall and courtyard seems designed for movement, procession, or performance. At its center was ritual, frescoes. Cover the walls are not simple decoration. They are hints of practices central to Minoan life. Most striking are the images of bull leaping. In these scenes, acrobats, men and women alike, grab the horns of a charging bull, vault onto its back, and flip gracefully to the ground. Whether this was sport, sacrifice, or symbolic drama is unclear, but the danger is obvious. To leap a bull required courage, strength, and training. It may have represented a ritual of renewal, a display of mastery over chaos, a rite of passage for the youth of Crete. The bull itself loomed large in Minoan culture. From frescoes to pottery, its image recurs endlessly. Horns of consecration stylized, bull horns carved from stone-crowned palaces and shrines. Later, myths of the Minotaur, half man and half bull, may reflect this fascination. For the Minoans, The bull was not just an animal, but a symbol of strength, fertility, and divine power. Rituals extended beyond bulls. Snake goddess figurines with wide eyes and outstretched arms suggest cults centered on renewal, fertility, and the natural world. Shrines found in caves and mountaintops indicate worship beyond palace walls. Fire, libations, and offerings tied people to their gods. Unlike the temples of Mesopotamia or Egypt, where gods often appeared distant and cosmic, the Minoan divine seems more immediate, rooted in animals, earth, and daily life. Asterisk. But power, too, resided within these walls. Nasus was an administrative hub. Storerooms contained giant pithoi filled with oil, wine, and grain. Linear bead tablets from later Mycenaean times record inventories of goods, suggesting a palace economy where resources flowed in, were recorded, stored, and redistributed. Farmers and herders supplied the palace. In return, the palace supported craftsmen, priests, and, perhaps, warriors. Craftsmen in Nasus worked with remarkable skill. Pottery, painted with spirals, fish, and flowers, was exported across the Aegean. Metalworkers shaped bronze into tools and ornaments. Jewelers crafted delicate gold pieces, some depicting bees or double-axe symbols that may have carried sacred meaning. The double axe, or labris, appears repeatedly in Minoan art, perhaps connected to rituals of sacrifice or to the very idea of authority. The palace itself reflected this complexity. Multiple levels, staircases, and rooms gave it an air of labyrinthine mystery. Some scholars suggest it was deliberately designed to confuse, to create a sense of awe and disorientation. Others see it as the practical result of centuries of rebuilding after earthquakes. Either way, the experience of moving through Nasus-light wells, painted corridors, to open courtyards must have felt different from the rigid, imposing halls of Mesopotamian or Egyptian rulers. Women, at least in art, appear with unusual prominence. Frescoes show women richly dressed, leading processions, performing rituals, standing as priestesses. Whether this reflects actual status or symbolic representation is debated, but the imagery suggests that women in Minoan culture played central roles, not confined solely to domestic spheres. Their presence in ritual art contrasts with the male-dominated depictions of many neighboring societies. Nasus was also connected outward. Its location on Crete gave the Minoans command of the sea. Archaeological finds suggest trade with Egypt, Anatolia, and the Levant. Egyptian records mention goods from Crete, and Minoan pottery appears as far away as Cyprus and Syria. Some historians even speak of a thalassocracy, a sea empire. Minoan ships patrolled and dominated the Aegean. Whether empire or influence, the sea was their lifeline. And yet, for all its brilliance, the Minoan world carried fragility. Crete lay near volcanic zones, vulnerable to earthquakes. The island of Thera, today's Santorini, erupted catastrophically. Around 1600 BCE, one of the largest volcanic explosions in history, ash spread across the Aegean. Some believe this eruption contributed to the decline of the Minoans, disrupting trade, agriculture, and stability. Others argue the Minoans endured for a century after, only to fall later to Mycenaean conquest. The truth may lie between. Disaster weakened them, leaving them open to invasion. Nasus itself was rebuilt multiple times, each reconstruction layered. New walls over old, creating the maze-like complexity we see today. This resilience suggests a culture accustomed to disaster, capable of recovery. But resilience has limits. By the 14th century BCE, the palace was finally abandoned, its frescoes fading, storerooms empty. What lingers is mystery. The undeciphered linear script keeps their language hidden. Their religion, their myths, their daily thoughts remain locked away. We see only images: dolphins leaping, priestesses standing, bulls charging, and interpret them through the lens of later cultures. The Greeks turned their memory into myth. Minos, Ariadne, the labyrinth, Theseus. Perhaps myth is the echo of history, distorted but persistent, so Nasus stands as both real and unreal. Its stones, frescoes, and pythoi are solid, but its meaning is elusive. Was it ruled by kings, or by priestesses, or by councils? Was it an empire of the sea, or a cultural hub connected by trade? Was its fall sudden or slow erosion? The palace does not answer. It only invites questions, and perhaps that is its greatest power. In its ruins, Nasus forces us to reflect not only on what we know, but on what we cannot know. It reminds us that history is fragile, that civilizations rise in brilliance, yet leave behind only fragments, inviting endless interpretation. But what if the greatest mystery is not how Nasus fell, but how it thrived for so long? It's balancing ritual, economy, and seafaring in a labyrinth that was at once palace, temple, and marketplace. Asterisk, by the time Nasus reached its final centuries, the palace had already endured much: earthquakes, fires, and the shifting tides of trade. Its storerooms had been filled and emptied countless times. Its frescoes had been painted, repainted, and plastered over again. Yet the palace still stood as a symbol of Minoan endurance, a labyrinth of power and ritual. But no civilization endures forever. The eruption of Thera, around 1600 BCE, looms large in discussions of Minoan decline. This eruption, one of the most violent in recorded prehistory, shattered the island of Santorini and sent waves across the Aegean. Ash clouds may have dimmed the skies, disrupted agriculture, and unsettled trade. Tsunamis may have struck Crete's shores, damaging harbors and fleets. The disaster did not erase Minoan culture overnight, but it left scars. The resilience that had rebuilt Nasus after earthquakes was tested on a larger scale in the century that followed. Nasus appears to have remained a dominant center. Trade continued, frescoes were painted, rituals persisted, but cracks widened. On the Greek mainland, the Mycenaeans were rising, a warrior elite who admired Minoan culture, but also sought to control it. Around 1450 BCE, evidence shows that many Minoan sites were destroyed, and Nasus itself came under Mycenaean influence. Linear bead tablets from this period, written in Greek but using the Minoan script, record inventories of goods in the palace storerooms, suggest that Mycenaeans had taken control, using Nasus as an administrative hub. This shift marks a turning point. The Minoans, once rulers of the sea, were now subject to mainland powers. Nasus survived as an administrative center for another century, but by 1375 BCE, it was abandoned. The reasons remain debated: perhaps fire, perhaps internal revolt, perhaps simply the weight of decline. Whatever the cause, the palace fell silent. Its labyrinth was left to crumble, its frescoes to fade, its storerooms to empty. And yet, the memory of Nasus endured. The Greeks of later centuries told tales of King Minos, of a monstrous minotaur hidden in a labyrinth, of a hero named Theseus who slew the beast and escaped with the help of Ariadne's thread. These myths may distort history, but they echo truths: the labyrinthine nature of the palace, the importance of bulls in Minoan ritual, the sense of a powerful and mysterious kingdom on Crete. Archaeology has restored fragments of this memory. When Arthur Evans excavated Nasus in the early 20th century, he saw in its maze-like ruins the labyrinth of legend. Its reconstructions, controversial but influential, painted frescoes anew, raised columns, rebuilt staircases. He believed he was bringing the Minoans back to life. Critics argue he imposed his own vision, blending fact with imagination. Still, without Evans, Nasus would remain a tangle of rubble. His work ensured that the Minoans would not be forgotten again. Today, the palace tells a story both vivid and incomplete. We see frescoes of dolphins, women in elaborate dress, bull leapers, mid-flight. We walk through storerooms lined with giant jars. We descend staircases into halls that once echoed with ritual and administration, but we cannot hear their words. Linear, the script of the Minoans, remains undeciphered. Their language, their laws, their myths, silent. We see their images, but not their voices. What, then, was Nasus? A palace of kings, as Evans believed, a temple of goddesses, as some argue, an administrative hub, as the tablets suggest, or all of these together, a labyrinth where politics, economy, religion, and culture merged. Perhaps the answer lies not in choosing one, but in accepting the complexity of all. For the Minoans, Nasus was life itself, center of trade, of ritual, of power. For later Greeks, it became myth, a place of monsters and heroes. For us, it is both an archaeological site and a symbol of mystery, a reminder of how civilizations shine and fade, leaving behind fragments that inspire endless stories. And so, the question remains, when we remember Nasus, do we see it as history or as myth, as a palace of jars and frescoes, or as a labyrinth of memory? Taps it as both, and perhaps that is why it endures. Asterisk, far to the east of Mesopotamia and Egypt, along the wide floodplains of the Indus River, another great Bronze Age civilization flourished between 2600 and 1900 BCE. The Indus Valley civilizations, sometimes called Harappan-built cities, as large and organized as the cities of the Indus stand out for their planning. Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, Dholavira, and others were laid out on grids, their streets intersecting at right angles. Houses were built of baked brick, remarkably uniform in size and shape. Wells dotted neighborhoods, providing water within easy reach. Most striking of all were the drains-covered channels running beneath streets, carrying waste away from homes. In Mohenjo-daro, archaeologists uncovered private bathrooms with water chutes connected to drains. No other Bronze Age culture matched this concern for sanitation. The Great Bath of Mohenjo-daro remains one of the civilization's most enigmatic structures. A large rectangular pool, lined with bricks and bitumen to make it watertight. It was surrounded by colonnades and small rooms. Was it a ritual space for purification? A civic gathering place? A religious center? Its true purpose is unknown, but its very existence suggests a society that valued communal rituals, water, and order. Daily life in these cities emerges from artifacts left behind. Farmers grew wheat, barley, and peas, using plows and irrigation. They domesticated cattle, water buffalo, and goats. In village courtyards, women ground grain on stone querns, while men repaired tools or tended herds. Potters shaped clay into vessels, often decorated with simple geometric designs. Beads made from carnelian, shell, or faience were strung into jewelry. The Indus people were skilled traders. Seals carved from steatite, inscribed with animal motifs and symbols, were used to mark goods. These seals have been found not only across the Indus Valley, but also in Mesopotamia, where merchants recorded dealings with distant Harappan traders. From the Indus came cotton textiles, beads, and possibly timber. In return came metals, wool, and luxuries. Trade flowed along rivers and seas, connecting the Indus to the wider Bronze Age world. Yet what is most striking about the Indus is its silence. In Mesopotamia, clay tablets speak endlessly of kings, gods, and grain. In Egypt, hieroglyphs proclaimed the deeds of pharaohs. But the Indus script, inscribed on seals and pottery, remains undeciphered. Without it, we cannot hear their voices. We do not know their rulers, names, their myths, their laws. The uniformity of their cities suggests central planning, but by whom? Were they ruled by priests, councils, merchant guilds? Torah was there, society more collective, less hierarchical. No definitive answers emerge. The absence of monumental kingship is equally puzzling. There are no massive statues, no royal tombs, no pyramids. The cities themselves are the monuments, practical, enduring. This has led some to suggest that Indus society valued collective order over individual glory, where Mesopotamia celebrated kings who claimed divine sanction. The Indus celebrated something else, a system of life built on balance, water, and trade. But life was not easy. Floods threatened the cities as the Indus River shifted its course over centuries. Its crops depended on unpredictable monsoon rains. Disease likely spread in crowded urban neighborhoods. Yet, the civilization endured for centuries, maintaining its quiet order across a vast territory larger than Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. Then, slowly, it declined. Around 1900 BCE, cities began to shrink. Trade with Mesopotamia dwindled. The script vanished. People moved from cities back to villages. The reasons remain debated: climate change, river shifts, declining trade, or internal stress. Whatever the cause, the great cities of the Indus fell silent. Their drains clogged, their streets emptied, their great bath dried. Today, the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro stand under the hot sun of Pakistan's Sindh province. Its brick streets, long eroded, still show the outlines of grids. Its great bath remains. Though dry, its silence is heavy. Unlike Egypt or Mesopotamia, where texts tell stories of kings and gods, the Indus tells us little. Its greatness is seen not in words, but in bricks, drains, and beads. And so we wonder, what kind of society built these cities? What myths did they tell? What gods did they honor? What rulers did they follow, if any? Was theirs a civilization more equal than others, or simply one that expressed hierarchy differently? The silence of the Indus is its greatest enigma. Perhaps the real story of the Indus Valley lies not in kings or battles, but in its streets, straight, ordered, lined with drains. A civilization that cared less for monuments of stone and more for the quiet structures that made life livable. But what drove such order, and why did it fade into silence? Asterisk, if the first glimpse of the Indus Valley shows us its silent streets and well-planned cities, a closer look reveals the patterns of life within them. Work that sustained households, rituals that shaped belief, and routines that carried meaning in the absence of grand kings or monuments. The rhythm of the Indus began with the land itself. Farmers rose with the sun, tending wheat, barley, peas, and sesame. Irrigation channels diverted river water to fields, though the unpredictable monsoon rains remained both blessing and threat. Surplus, grain-filled storerooms, some attached to large public buildings that archaeologists call granaries. These stores may have been managed collectively, suggesting that resources were shared, measured, and redistributed by officials or councils. Craftsmen filled the cities with their work. Potters shaped clay into jars, bowls, and cups, many adorned with geometric design circles, waves, zigzags. Bead makers drilled tiny holes into carnelian and lapis lazuli, stringing them into necklaces prized across the Bronze Age world. Metalworkers forged copper tools and ornaments. Shell workers carved bangles from conch shells brought from coastal waters. The uniformity of their products, similar weights, similar designs suggests a system of standards, perhaps controlled by authorities who valued order above individuality. The Indus script, found mostly on seals and small tablets, deepens the mystery. These seals often depict animals, bulls, elephants, rhinoceroses, tigers, unicorn-like figures. Were these clan symbols, markers of identity, representations of gods? The script that accompanies them is brief, usually just a few signs, leaving little to interpret. Without decipherment, we cannot know if they recorded names, prayers, or contracts. Their brevity hints at a functional system, but one closed to us, ritual life, left subtler traces. Unlike Egypt or Mesopotamia, there are no vast temples, no colossal statues of gods. Instead, religion seems woven into smaller spaces. The Great Bath of Mohenjo-Daro suggests ritual purification. Fire altars at sites like Calibangan indicate ceremonies tied to flame and offerings. Terracotta figurines of women, some holding infants, suggest fertility cults. Seals depicting animals may also point to totemic or divine associations. The divine here feels embedded in nature, fertility, and the cycles of life. Music, dance, and performance may have been part of this world, though little survives. A famous small bronze statue known as the Dancing Girl, found at Mohenjo-Daro, shows a young woman with one hand on her hip, adorned with bangles. Her posture is confident, almost defiant. She reminds us that behind the uniform bricks were people with spirit, expression, and presence. Trade connected the Indus outward. Cotton textiles, perhaps among the first in the world, traveled along. Routes to Mesopotamia. Carnelian beads from the Indus have been found in Ur and other cities, while Mesopotamian records mention Meluhha. It's believed to be the Indus. In return came silver, wool, and luxuries. Harbors like Lathal show docks and warehouses, evidence of seafaring merchants. The Indus was not isolated, was woven into the larger Bronze Age economy. Within the cities, order dominated. Streets were laid in grids, houses, often 2 stories, tall, with standardized bricks. Wells dotted neighborhoods, providing water close at hand. Some houses had private baths with drains leading to the city's covered sewage channels. The attention to sanitation is unparalleled in the Bronze Age, where Mesopotamian cities were crowded and foul-smelling. The Indus sought cleanliness, order, and balance. But what kind of society created such uniformity? The absence of palaces, royal tombs, or large temples leaves us puzzled. Perhaps authority rested in councils, guilds, or assemblies, rather than kings. Perhaps priests guided rituals, but not politics. Perhaps merchants and administrators managed cities collectively, or perhaps rulers did exist, but chose not to glorify themselves in stone. Whatever the truth, the Indus stands apart, a civilization without obvious monarchs, where the collective outweighed the individual. Life was not without hardship. Floods threatened homes, forcing repairs. The shifting Indus River, sometimes abandoned. Old channels, leaving fields barren and settlements stranded. Disease likely spread in dense neighborhoods, though sanitation may have lessened its impact. Malnutrition, accidents, and infant mortality shadowed life, as they did in all ancient societies. Yet resilience is evident. Cities endured for centuries, rebuilt after floods, maintained. When decline came around 1900 BCE, it was gradual. Cities shrank, houses were abandoned, streets filled with debris. Some people moved eastward toward the Ganges plain. Others returned to village life. Trade with Mesopotamia ceased. The script disappeared, leaving silence behind. Yet the people did not vanish. They adapted, shifted, carried fragments of culture into new ages. The Indus Valley leaves us with questions that may never be answered. Did they have kings, or was power shared? Were there gods embodied in bulls, elephants, and rivers? What stories did they tell? What songs did they sing? What fears and hopes did they share? The silence of their script denies us answers, and yet, perhaps, the silence is itself an answer. The Indus speaks not in monuments to rulers, but in streets, drains, beads, and bricks. It tells us that order, health, and trade can define a civilization as much as armies or palaces. It reminds us that greatness can be quiet, practical, and collective. But what if their silence was not only absence, but choice? What if they chose not to glorify kings, not to raise monuments, not to leave bombastic records? What if they sought stability over spectacle? Asterisk, by the middle of the second millennium BCE, the Indus Valley civilization had already endured 4 centuries. Streets had carried generations of footsteps. Its drains had channeled water and waste. Its workshops had produced beads and pottery. Its harbors had connected distant lands. Yet by 1900 BCE, this world began to unravel, not in fire or conquest, but in silence. Unlike Mesopotamia, where city after city was sacked, or Egypt, where pharaohs fought wars to preserve their realms, the Indus seems to have declined slowly, almost quietly. Cities were gradually abandoned, granaries emptied. Seals were no longer pressed into clay. Trade with Mesopotamia ceased. By 1700 BCE, the great centers of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa had shrunk into shadows of themselves. Why did this happen? Theories abound. Climate change may have altered the monsoon, bringing drought or shifting rainfall patterns. The Indus River itself changed course, leaving some settlements dry while flooding others. Trade routes may have shifted, cutting off access to Mesopotamian markets. Some suggest internal decline, soil exhaustion, disease, or overpopulation. But the truth is that no single cause explains it all. A civilization so vast and complex likely fell for many reasons at once. What is striking is the absence of violence in the archaeological record. There are no signs of massive wars, no burnt layers across every city, no armies sweeping through. The Indus seems to have faded, its cities crumbling, not under conquest, but under the weight of gradual change. People drifted back to smaller villages, carrying fragments of their culture with them, and yet their silence persists. When the script vanished, so too did their voices. Unlike Mesopotamia or Egypt, where texts preserve names, laws, and prayers, the Indus left us only undeciphered symbols. We do not know what they called themselves, what they believed, or what stories they told as they watched their cities decline. Their history is written in bricks and beads, not in words. Archaeology offers fragments. Skeletons found in Mohenjo-Daro suggest sudden events, perhaps disease. Abandoned wells and clogged drains speak of neglect. Houses were reused, partitioned, altered as populations shrank. Crafts continued for a time, but with less skill and uniformity. The order that had once defined their cities gave way to improvisation, yet decline was not disappearance. The descendants of the Indus carried on. Villages in northern India and Pakistan show continuity in pottery styles, agricultural practices, and even town layouts. Cotton cultivation, pioneered by the Indus, spread onward. Bead-making traditions survived. Rituals tied to fire and water may have echoed into later Hindu practices. The Indus did not vanish, it transformed, but the memory of its great cities was lost for millennia. Like Egypt's pyramids or Mesopotamia's ziggurats, the ruins of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro were buried under soil and forgotten. Local villagers sometimes reused bricks for building, unaware of their ancient origins. It was only in the 19th century, under British colonial surveys, that archaeologists rediscovered the Indus sites. Suddenly, history expanded to include a third great Bronze Age civilization, as vast and advanced as Mesopotamia and Egypt. What makes the Indus haunting is its silence. We see its drains, but not its gods. We walk its streets, but hear no voices. We admire its beads and pottery, but cannot name their makers. We look at its seals and wonder what the animals meant, what the signs recorded, what messages were carried across seas. This silence invites reflection. In Mesopotamia, kings claimed credit for everything. In Egypt, pharaohs inscribed their names on stone. But in the Indus, the collective overshadowed the individual. Perhaps they did not seek immortality in monuments. Perhaps they sought it in order, in balance, in quiet continuity. If so, theirs is a very different vision of civilization, one that values stability over spectacle, community over kingship. Yet we cannot help but wonder, what myths were told beside the Great Bath? What prayers were whispered at fire altars? What songs accompanied bead making, weaving, or harvest? What fears haunted families as floods rose or rains failed? These voices are gone, and perhaps they will never return. And so the Indus Valley remains both great and elusive. Its bricks tell of planning, its drains of care, its beads of beauty, its seals of identity. But its silence tells us something else, that not all civilizations seek to be remembered through words or monuments. Some leave only traces of order, fragments of daily life, echoes of forgotten streets. Standing amid the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro today, one might feel the weight of that silence. Streets still stretch in straight lines. Wells still punctuate neighborhoods. The Great Bath still holds its shape. But no sound rises from them, no cries of merchants, no laughter of children, no chants of priests. Only wind and dust move through the ruins, and perhaps that is the legacy of the Indus, not in words, but in silence. A reminder that civilizations can thrive, endure, and vanish without leaving the stories we expect. A reminder that order, balance, and community can define greatness as much as kings or wars. The Indus Valley's streets may be silent, but their silence speaks of resilience, of mystery, and of the fragility of human memory. Asterisk, while Mesopotamia carved its words into clay, and the Indus laid out its silent streets. In ancient China, another Bronze Age civilization emerged, one defined not by drains or labyrinths, but by ritual. Around 1600 BCE, the Shang dynasty rose along the Yellow River Valley, establishing one of the earliest dynastic states in East Asia. Its power was not only in armies or harvests, but in bronze cast into massive vessels, intricate weapons, and sacred symbols that bound the living to their ancestors. The Shang were master metalworkers. Unlike the hammered bronze of Mesopotamia, the Shang perfected the art of piece mold casting. Clay molds were carefully crafted in sections, carved with patterns of dragons, touty masks, and swirling motifs. Molten bronze was poured into the molds, filling every crevice. Then the clay was broken away, leaving vessels of astonishing complexity. Some weighed hundreds of pounds, their surfaces alive with animals and spirits. These vessels were not mere tools. They were sacred. They were used in rituals of divination, in ancestor worship, ceremonies that defined Shang society. To the Shang, ancestors were not distant memories. They were active, powerful forces who could influence the living. Kings offered food and drink to them in bronze vessels, seeking blessings for harvests, victories, and stability. Without ritual, order could collapse. Archaeological finds at Anyang, the last Shang capital, revealed rows of these vessels buried in royal tombs. Some tombs also contained chariots, weapons, and human sacrifices, servants, guards, and even war. Captives buried with their rulers to serve them in the afterlife. To us, it may seem brutal, but to the Shang, it was continuity. The ruler's authority extended beyond death. Hun, his retinue, followed him into eternity. Bronze weapons also defined Shang power. Spears, dagger axes, and arrowheads armed there. Armies, chariots, drawn by horses, carried warriors into battle, their fittings gleaming with bronze. Warfare was constant against neighboring tribes, against rivals within. Yet battle itself was part of ritual, victories legitimized by offerings to ancestors. speeds, explained by failures in ceremony. Daily life for the common Shang farmer was far removed from this splendor. Fields of millet, wheat, and rice provided the staples of diet. Farmers used wooden plows tipped with bronze, reaped crops with bronze sickles, and carried water in ceramic jars. Their houses were simple, often semi-subterranean pit dwellings, cool in summer, warm in winter. They lived under the weight of obligations, labor for the state, harvests for the granary, sacrifices for the gods. But the presence of bronze, by the 11th century BCE, the Shang dynasty's world of bronze and ritual had reached its twilight. The dynasty had endured for centuries, binding society through ceremonies, ancestor worship, and the power of kingship mediated by ritual. Yet even systems that seem eternal can falter. As new powers rose in the West, the Shang order began to unravel. The Zhou people, once tributaries of the Shang, grew stronger. Around 1046 BCE, they overthrew the Shang in the Battle of Mai. Accounts preserved centuries later describe the fall as swift, some Shang soldiers refusing to fight, weary of the burdens imposed by endless ritual and sacrifice. Whether this account is embellished or not, the Shang collapse marked the end of one of the earliest great dynasties in East Asia. But collapse was not erasure. The Zhou inherited much from the Shang bronze casting, ancestor worship, and the use of ritual to justify rule. They reframed kingship, introducing the concept of the mandate of heaven, the idea that rulers governed only with divine approval, and that unjust rulers could lose legitimacy. In this way, Shang traditions shaped Chinese thought for millennia. Even as their dynasty ended, archaeology reveals both the grandeur and brutality of the Shang. At Anyang, the last Shang capital, royal tombs remained filled with treasures, bronze vessels, jade ornaments, chariots, and sacrificed humans and animals. The tomb of Fu Hao, a Shang queen and military leader, contained over 1,000 objects, bronze weapons, ritual vessels, jade, ivory. Her burial shows that women could wield authority, both in life and in death, within the Shang system. The vessels themselves remain the most striking legacy. Even today, standing before a Shangding or Zan in a museum, one is struck by their weight, their scale, their intricacy. The Taoti mask, staring with bulging eyes, is as mysterious now as it was then. Were these faces of spirits, or simply artistic conventions? Did they frighten, protect, or simply proclaim power? The answer is lost, but the impression remains. Writing, too, endured. The oracle bone inscriptions, brief, functional, tied to divination, became the foundation of later Chinese script. From these early questions to ancestors, Chinese writing evolved into a system that still connects modern readers to the Bronze Age past. The Shang gave words permanence, not for poetry or stories, but for ritual. In their devotion, they left behind a legacy of literacy for the common people. However, life may have changed little with the dynasty's fall. Farmers still planted millet, harvested wheat, tended pigs and cattle. Craftsmen still smelted bronze. Now, for Zhou rulers instead of Shang, the cycles of obligation continued, though the names of kings changed. Their lives were shaped not by dynastic politics, but by the unending weight of survival, ritual, and labor. What distinguishes the Shang is not conquest alone, but the fusion of material and spiritual. Bronze was not simply a tool, it was the vessel of communication with the ancestors. Writing was not merely recorded, was divine question and answer. Kingship was not only governance, it was ritual duty. Every act of state was also an act of worship, and yet we are left to wonder, what did ordinary people think of this system? Did they believe wholeheartedly that their ancestors spoke through cracks and bones, that their crops depended on bronze vessels filled with offerings? Or did some question, quietly, whether rituals serve the living or the dead. The oracle bones preserve only the voices of kings. The doubts of farmers and craftsmen remain unrecorded, swallowed by silence. Still, the Shang legacy endures. Their bronze vessels sit in museums, their inscriptions studied by scholars. Their rituals remembered in echoes of ancestor worships still practiced in parts of China today. They remind us that civilizations are not only built on stone and wood, but on belief, on the conviction that unseen ancestors demand offerings. That order depends on ritual. That metal can carry meaning. The Shang dynasty's world of bronze. Rituals may seem alien to us, yet its themes are universal. Power tied to belief. Communities bound by ceremony. The attempt to bridge past and present, life and death. The desire to give permanence to fragile human existence through fire, metal, and memory. And so, the Shang remind us that civilizations do not endure by force alone.